Maria Rodriguez stood at the back of the university music hall, her hands trembling as she clutched her worn notebook. The prestigious Westfield Academy of Music buzzed with activity as students prepared for their weekly vocal assessments. She had dreamed of this moment for years, saving every penny from her job at the local diner to afford just one semester at this elite institution. The daughter of immigrant parents who worked double shifts at a textile factory, Maria had grown up listening to her grandmother's old opera records in their tiny apartment. While other children played video games, she would close her eyes and imagine herself on the grand stages her grandmother described from the old country. Her voice, untrained but powerful, would fill their cramped living room as she sang along to Puccini and Verdi. Now, surrounded by students who had attended private music schools and received years of professional training, Maria felt completely out of place. Their designer clothes contrasted sharply with her thrift store finds. Their confident chatter about summer programs in Europe and private lessons with renowned teachers made her stomach turn. She had learned everything from YouTube videos and library books. Professor Margaret Steinberg, the head of vocal studies, was known throughout the music world for her sharp tongue and impossibly high standards. Students whispered that she had once made a tenor cry during La Bohème. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a perfect bun, and her piercing blue eyes seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. She had trained at the most prestigious conservatories and performed at the Metropolitan Opera before becoming an educator. When Maria's name was called for her assessment, the whispers began immediately. Several students in the front row turned to look at her with barely concealed smirks. Jessica Hampton, whose father was a famous conductor, leaned over to whisper something to her friend that made them both laugh. Maria recognized the look. It was the same expression she had seen countless times growing up in her working-class neighborhood. When people learned about her musical dreams, Maria walked to the piano with as much dignity as she could manage. The pianist, a stern-looking graduate student, barely glanced up as she handed him her sheet music. She had chosen a simple art song, something she felt confident she could handle without embarrassing herself completely. Her voice teacher from community college had assured her it would be appropriate for an assessment. Professor Steinberg looked at the music and raised an eyebrow. The piece was far below the level typically performed at Westfield. Most students chose challenging arias or complex art songs that showed off their technical skills and years of training. Maria's choice immediately marked her as an outsider, someone who didn't understand the unspoken expectations of this elite environment. As Maria took her position, she could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. The silence was deafening. She had performed at her community college and local venues, but never had she felt such judgment radiating from an audience. These students had been groomed for success from childhood, attending summer programs that cost more than her family's monthly rent. The piano introduction began, and Maria opened her mouth to sing. Her voice, though naturally beautiful, cracked slightly on the first note due to nerves. A few students exchanged glances. She recovered quickly, her training with Mrs. Chen at the community center helping her find her footing. As she continued, her voice grew stronger and more confident, filling the hall with a warmth and authenticity that was rare among her classmates. But it wasn't enough. When she finished, Professor Steinberg's expression remained unchanged. She made a few notes on her paper and simply said, "Thank you, Miss Rodriguez. Please see me after class." The other students continued their assessments, performing pieces that showcased years of expensive training. There was Thomas, who had studied at the Royal Academy during his gap year. Sarah, whose mother was a famous mezzo-soprano, performed a challenging Brahms piece with technical precision. Each performance reminded Maria of how far behind she was, how much she didn't know about the world she was trying to enter. After class, Maria approached Professor Steinberg's desk with her heart pounding. The older woman looked up from her papers with an expression that was difficult to read. Maria braced herself for the inevitable conversation about whether she belonged at Westfield, whether her background had prepared her for the rigors of serious musical study. "Miss Rodriguez," Professor Steinberg began, her voice carrying the authority of decades in the music world, "your technical skills need significant work. Your breathing technique is inconsistent. Your diction could be clearer, and your understanding of musical interpretation is quite basic." Maria's heart sank. She had expected this, but hearing it stated so bluntly still hurt. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she tried to speak. Professor Steinberg continued, However, there is something in your voice that intrigues me. A natural quality that cannot be taught. Raw talent that with proper training could develop into something quite special. Maria looked up, surprised by this unexpected turn. I'm going to make you an offer, the professor said, leaning back in her chair. There's a master class in 6 weeks featuring guest artists from the Metropolitan Opera. It's typically reserved for our most advanced students. The piece they'll be working on is one of the most challenging coloratura arias in the repertoire, the Queen of the Night's aria from Mozart's Magic Flute. Maria's eyes widened. She knew the piece by reputation. It was notorious for its incredibly high notes and rapid coloratura passages. It was considered one of the most technically demanding pieces in all of opera, requiring years of specialized training to perform properly. I want you to prepare this aria and perform it at the master class, Professor Steinberg said, her eyes never leaving Maria's face. If you can master it, you'll prove that you belong here. If you cannot, perhaps you should consider whether Westfield is the right place for you. The challenge hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Maria knew this was more than just an assignment. It was a test that would determine her entire future at the Academy. 6 weeks to learn one of opera's most difficult pieces, with no private teacher and limited resources. As Maria left the music hall that evening, she could hear some of her classmates talking about her behind her back. The whispers followed her across campus, but for the first time since arriving at Westfield, she felt a spark of determination burning in her chest. She had 6 weeks to prove them all wrong. Maria spent her first sleepless night staring at the sheet music for the Queen of the Night aria. The black notes scattered across the pages looked like an impossible puzzle. The piece demanded a vocal range that seemed to stretch beyond human capability, with high Fs that soared above the staff like musical mountains she had never attempted to climb. Her tiny dorm room became a fortress of determination. While her roommate attended social events and study groups, Maria surrounded herself with recordings, music theory books, and language dictionaries. The German text was another obstacle. She had never studied the language, and every word needed to be researched, practiced, and perfected. She created flashcards with phonetic pronunciations covering her desk, walls, and mirror with reminders. The university's practice rooms were always occupied during peak hours, so Maria found herself singing in the most unusual places. The basement laundry room at 3 a.m. became her private concert hall. The empty chapel during dinner time offered perfect acoustics. Sometimes she would walk to the parking garage and use the echo of the concrete structure to hear her voice from different angles. Word of Professor Steinberg's challenge spread quickly through the music department. Students who had barely acknowledged Maria's existence now watched her with curious eyes. Some looked at her with pity, others with barely concealed amusement. The general consensus was clear: this was impossible. Even advanced students with years of training rarely attempted the Queen of the Night aria before their senior year. Jessica Hampton made sure to comment loudly whenever Maria passed by. I heard someone actually thinks they can sing the Queen of the Night, she would say to her friends, laughing. Some people have no idea how difficult real opera is. Her comments always came with a sweet smile that made them even more cutting. Thomas, the student who had studied in London, was more direct. One day in the hallway, he approached Maria with false concern. You know, the Queen of the Night aria has ended careers, he said. Professional sopranos have damaged their voices permanently attempting those high notes. Maybe you should choose something more appropriate for your level. But Maria had encountered doubt before. Growing up, guidance counselors had suggested she consider more realistic career paths. Music teachers had warned her that without family connections and private lessons, she would never make it in classical music. These voices of discouragement had followed her throughout her life, and she had learned to use them as fuel rather than let them extinguish her dreams. Her breakthrough came during her second week of preparation. While practicing in the empty cafeteria after closing time, Maria discovered something unexpected about her voice. As she worked through the coloratura passages slowly, note by note, she realized her voice had a natural agility that years of belting songs at the diner had actually helped develop. Her untrained technique had some unconventional aspects that, surprisingly, made certain passages easier rather than harder. Mrs. Chen, her former teacher from the community center, agreed to help via video calls. Though she had never taught opera at this level, Her understanding of vocal anatomy and breathing techniques proved invaluable. Together, they broke down the aria into manageable sections, building Maria's stamina and confidence one phrase at a time. The physical demands of the piece were unlike anything Maria had experienced. The aria required breath control that could sustain long, flowing lines while maintaining precision in rapid passages. She began jogging at dawn, not for fitness but to build the lung capacity needed for the demanding vocal athletics ahead. Her diet changed too. No more late-night pizza runs with classmates. Every meal was planned to support her voice. 3 weeks into her preparation, Maria faced her first major crisis. While attempting one of the highest passages, she felt a sharp pain in her throat. Panic set in immediately. She had pushed too hard, too fast. The fear of permanent damage haunted her as she observed vocal rest for 3 days, communicating only through written notes and gestures. During those silent days, doubt crept in like a poison. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was being foolish to attempt something so far beyond her current abilities. She watched videos of legendary sopranos performing the aria: Diana Damrau, Natalie Dessay, Beverly Sills, and wondered what had made her think she could join their ranks. But when her voice returned, stronger than before, Maria realized something had changed. The forced rest had allowed her vocal cords to adapt to the new demands. She approached the piece with more wisdom, more patience, and surprisingly, more success. The notes that had seemed impossible were now within reach. Her classmates began to notice changes in her singing during other classes. Even in simple exercises, her voice carried a new power and precision. Professor Martinez, who taught music theory, commented that her pitch accuracy had improved dramatically. Other faculty members began paying attention to the quiet girl who spent every spare moment in practice rooms. The transformation wasn't just vocal. Maria's confidence grew with every small victory. When she successfully navigated a particularly challenging coloratura passage, she felt like she had climbed Everest. Each high F she managed to reach cleanly was a personal triumph that built her belief in what was possible. But the whispers continued. Students speculated about whether she would actually go through with the performance or find an excuse to back out. Some made bets about how long she would last before cracking under pressure. The anticipation built throughout the music department as the master class approached. Maria's family knew nothing about the specific challenge she faced. In her weekly phone calls home, she spoke in general terms about her studies, not wanting to worry her parents or create expectations she might not be able to meet. Her grandmother, now in her 80s, would always ask about her singing, sharing stories of the great opera singers she had loved in her youth. One evening, while practicing in the chapel, Maria was surprised to find Professor Steinberg sitting quietly in the back pew. The older woman had been listening, though for how long Maria couldn't be sure. When their eyes met, Professor Steinberg simply nodded and left without a word. That silent acknowledgement meant more to Maria than any praise could have. With 2 weeks remaining, Maria felt ready to attempt the full aria without stopping. The piece that had once seemed like an impossible mountain now felt like a challenging but achievable climb. Her voice had found strength she never knew existed, and her musical understanding had deepened in ways that surprised even her. The master class was announced to the entire university community. Guest artists from the Metropolitan Opera would work with selected students in a public setting. Maria's name appeared on the program alongside the most advanced students in the school. Seeing her name in print made the challenge suddenly, terrifyingly real. The week before the master class, Maria's world began to shift in unexpected ways. News of her upcoming performance had somehow reached beyond the music department, creating ripples of curiosity throughout the campus. Students from other majors started showing up to her practice sessions, drawn by rumors of the impossible challenge she had accepted. Dr. Elizabeth Norton, the distinguished soprano from the Metropolitan Opera who would lead the master class, arrived 3 days early. Her reputation preceded her, a Grammy winner and international star who had performed on the world's most prestigious stages. Students gathered outside the music building just to catch a glimpse of her arriving in a black limousine. Maria's first encounter with Dr. Norton was during a routine practice session in the afternoon. She was working through the aria's most challenging section when she noticed someone had entered the practice room. Turning around, she found herself face to face with the opera legend herself, elegant in a simple black dress, her silver hair perfectly styled. "Don't stop," Dr. Norton said gently. "I was enjoying listening to your interpretation." Maria's heart nearly stopped beating. She had dreamed of meeting a professional opera singer, but never imagined it would happen like this in a small practice room while she was dressed in jeans and a university sweatshirt. Her voice caught as she tried to continue, suddenly self-conscious about every technical imperfection. Dr. Norton moved closer to the piano. "You have something quite rare," she said after Maria finished the passage. "Most young singers focus so intensely on technical perfection that they forget music is about communication. You're telling a story with every note." The encouragement was unexpected and overwhelming. Maria had prepared herself for criticism, for professional judgment that might crush her confidence. Instead, she found herself in conversation with someone who understood the deep passion that drove her to attempt the impossible. "Professor Steinberg told me about your background," Dr. Norton continued. "I started singing in church choirs in a small town in Ohio. My family thought opera was something only rich people did. Sometimes the hunger that comes from having to fight for your dreams creates the most authentic artistry." That evening, Maria called her grandmother for the first time in weeks. She found herself telling the whole story: the challenge, the mockery, the endless hours of practice, and now the approaching masterclass. Her grandmother listened quietly, then said something that stayed with Maria. "Mia, the most beautiful flowers grow through the hardest ground. Sing for those who said you couldn't." The day of the masterclass arrived with unusual spring weather. The university's main concert hall, which typically hosted only major events, had been chosen for the occasion. The beautiful space, with its soaring ceiling and perfect acoustics, could seat 800 people. Maria had never performed in a venue so grand or intimidating. Students began arriving early, filling the hall with nervous energy and anticipation. Maria spotted her classmates from vocal studies, including Jessica and Thomas, who had claimed seats in the front row. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence felt like a reminder of every doubt that had been voiced about her abilities. Local media had somehow learned about the event. A reporter from the city's arts magazine sat with a photographer, and Maria overheard them discussing the unusual story of the scholarship student attempting one of opera's greatest challenges. The attention made her stomach flutter with new anxieties she hadn't anticipated. Backstage, the selected students prepared in individual dressing rooms. Maria's space was tiny compared to the others, but she was grateful for the privacy. She had brought the same lucky scarf her grandmother had worn to her first opera performance decades ago. The faded silk carried the scent of her grandmother's perfume and memories of all the encouragement that had brought her to this moment. Professor Steinberg appeared at her dressing room door 30 minutes before the performance. She looked different somehow, less stern, more human than Maria had ever seen her. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that regardless of what happens today, you have already achieved something remarkable. The work you've done these past 6 weeks has been extraordinary." Maria felt tears threatening to surface, but she blinked them back. "Thank you for believing I could do this," she managed to say. "I didn't give you this challenge because I believed you could do it," Professor Steinberg replied with a slight smile. "I gave it to you because I wanted to see what would happen when you believed you could do it." The masterclass began with other students performing various pieces. Each performance was polished and technically proficient, showcasing years of expensive training and natural talent. The audience responded with polite applause, and Dr. Norton offered constructive feedback that demonstrated her expertise and experience. Maria watched from the wings, feeling her nerves build with each passing performance. Her mouth was dry despite the water she had been sipping all day. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her sheet music, though she knew the piece by memory better than her own name. When the intermission was announced, Maria realized she was next. Students filed out of the hall for refreshments, but she remained backstage, using the time for final vocal warm-ups and mental preparation. She thought about her parents, working their evening shifts at the factory, who had no idea their daughter was about to attempt something that could change the trajectory of her entire life. Dr. Norton found her during the break. "I've been thinking about your interpretation," she said. "The Queen of the Night is often portrayed as pure evil, but I hear something different in your voice. There's pain behind the anger, desperation behind the commands. Trust that instinct." As the audience returned and settled into their seats, Maria could feel the energy in the hall shift. Word had spread during intermission about what was coming next. The conversations were quieter, the anticipation more intense. Everyone knew they were about to witness either a triumph or a spectacular failure. Professor Steinberg took the stage to introduce the final performance. Her words were carefully chosen. Our next student has prepared one of the most challenging arias in the coloratura soprano repertoire. Maria Rodriguez will perform Der Hölle Rache from Mozart's The Magic Flute. A murmur went through the audience. Even people unfamiliar with opera knew this piece by reputation. The famous high Fs and rapid coloratura passages were legendary for their difficulty. Several audience members leaned forward in their seats, curious about the young woman who would dare attempt such a feat. Maria walked onto the stage, her grandmother's scarf draped carefully over her simple black dress. The stage lights were brighter than anything she had experienced, and the silence in the hall was profound. 800 pairs of eyes focused on her as she took her position next to the grand piano. The pianist, a distinguished professor who had accompanied countless master classes, looked at her with professional respect. He had seen the sheet music and knew what lay ahead. His gentle nod conveyed confidence in her preparation and readiness. Dr. Norton sat in the front row, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of Maria's posture and presence. This was the moment that would define not just the evening, but potentially the entire future of a young woman who had dared to dream beyond her circumstances. The opening chords of the Queen of the Night aria filled the concert hall with their ominous power. Maria felt the music wash over her like a familiar embrace, despite the hundreds of eyes watching her every move. In this moment, all the practice sessions, all the doubt, all the sleepless nights condensed into pure focus. Her entrance was flawless. The first phrase emerged from her voice with a clarity and power that surprised even her. The German text, which had been so foreign 6 weeks ago, now flowed naturally from her lips. She had become the vengeful queen, commanding the stage with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. The audience, which had been buzzing with anticipation, fell into complete silence. Even the skeptics in the front row found themselves leaning forward, drawn into the performance despite their expectations. Maria's voice filled every corner of the hall without any apparent strain, reaching listeners in the balcony with the same intensity as those in the front rows. Dr. Norton watched with growing amazement. In her decades of experience, she had heard this aria performed by the world's greatest sopranos, but there was something uniquely compelling about Maria's interpretation. The pain and desperation she had heard in practice were now fully realized. Creating a Queen of the Night who was more than just a villain, she was a mother driven to extremes by loss and fury. As Maria approached the first of the famous high passages, a collective breath was held throughout the hall. These were the notes that separated amateur singers from professionals, the musical mountains that had ended careers and destroyed confidence. The coloratura passage that led to the climactic high F was a minefield of technical challenges that required years of training to navigate safely. Maria entered the passage with complete confidence. Her voice danced through the rapid notes with an agility that seemed almost supernatural. Each note was perfectly placed, crystal clear, and musically purposeful. The technique that had seemed so impossible 6 weeks ago now felt as natural as breathing. When she reached the first high F, the note soared through the hall like a bird taking flight. It was pure, powerful, and sustained with remarkable control. A few audience members gasped audibly. Jessica Hampton's mouth fell open in disbelief. Even Thomas, who had been so certain of Maria's failure, found himself impressed despite his prejudices. But Maria was just getting started. The aria's second half contained even greater challenges, including the most feared high F in all of opera, longer, higher, and more exposed than the first. As she built toward this climactic moment, her voice seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker, defying the physical logic that suggested she should be tiring. Professor Steinberg watched from the wings with emotions she hadn't expected. She had issued the challenge partly to teach Maria a lesson about knowing her limitations, partly to see if raw talent could overcome lack of formal training. What she was witnessing exceeded her wildest hopes. For the young woman who had arrived at Westfield with such humble beginnings, the coloratura passages in the middle section showcased Maria's natural agility like nothing she had ever attempted. Her voice moved through the rapid-fire notes with precision and musicality that would have been impressive from a senior student, remarkable from someone with her background. The technique she had developed through necessity and determination was proving more effective than years of expensive lessons might have been. As Maria prepared for the final high F, the tension in the hall was palpable. This was the moment that would make or break the performance, the note that would determine whether she was a serious musician or just someone who had gotten lucky with the earlier passages. The orchestra excerpt led her to the edge of the musical cliff, and now she had to jump. The note that emerged was nothing short of miraculous. The high F rang through the concert hall with a purity and power that seemed to vibrate in the walls themselves. It was perfectly pitched, fearlessly sustained, and delivered with an emotional intensity that made the technical achievement secondary to the artistic impact. The note seemed to hang in the air forever, a testament to everything Maria had overcome to reach this moment. When she completed the aria, the silence that followed was profound. For several seconds, the 800 people in the audience seemed unable to process what they had just witnessed. Then, as if a dam had burst, the applause began. It started with Dr. Norton, who rose to her feet immediately, followed quickly by Professor Steinberg, and then row after row of audience members. The ovation that followed was unlike anything the concert hall had experienced during a student performance. People were cheering, some were crying, and everyone was on their feet. The local reporter was frantically taking notes, realizing she was witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. Jessica Hampton found herself applauding, despite her shock and disappointment. The performance had been so extraordinary that even personal jealousy couldn't diminish its impact. Thomas sat stunned, realizing that everything he thought he knew about vocal ability and training had just been challenged by what he had witnessed. Dr. Norton approached the stage with tears in her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the still applauding audience, "in 40 years of professional opera, I have rarely heard the Queen of the Night performed with such technical mastery and emotional authenticity. This young woman has just demonstrated why we study music, not just to achieve technical perfection, but to touch the human soul." As Maria stood on stage, overwhelmed by the response, she thought about her grandmother listening to those old records, about her parents working night shifts to support her dreams, about Mrs. Chen believing in her when no one else would. The little girl who had sung along to Puccini in a cramped apartment had just proven that dreams could triumph over circumstances. The master class had transformed from an academic exercise into a life-changing event, not just for Maria but for everyone who witnessed it. Students who had looked down on her 6 weeks ago now saw her completely differently. Faculty members who had barely noticed her existence were now viewing her as one of the most promising singers they had encountered. But perhaps most importantly, Maria herself had discovered something she never knew existed within her. The voice that had emerged that evening was not just technically accomplished, and it was the voice of someone who had found their true artistic identity through the crucible of an impossible challenge. As the applause finally began to subside and Maria prepared to leave the stage, she knew that everything had changed. The shy girl from the working-class family had walked onto that stage, but a confident artist was walking off. The mockery and doubt that had followed her for 6 weeks had been answered with the most powerful argument possible: undeniable excellence. The aftermath of Maria's performance created ripples that spread far beyond the concert hall. Within hours, videos recorded on cell phones began appearing on social media platforms. The university's official recording of the master class was uploaded to YouTube, where it quickly gained thousands of views from opera enthusiasts around the world who couldn't believe what they were hearing from a first-year student. Dr. Norton stayed at the university for 3 additional days, specifically to work with Maria on refining her technique and discussing future opportunities. During their private sessions, she shared insights from her own journey from small-town singer to international star, offering guidance that was both practical and deeply personal. "What you accomplished was remarkable," Dr. Norton told Maria during one of their sessions. "But now comes the harder challenge, building a sustainable career on this foundation. Talent alone isn't enough. You need to develop discipline, musical intelligence, and the resilience to handle both success and setbacks." The transformation in how other students treated Maria was immediate and dramatic. Jessica Hampton, who had been her harshest critic, approached her in the cafeteria 3 days after the performance. Her demeanor was completely different, respectful, almost humble. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I judged you based on things that don't matter. Your performance was incredible. Thomas, the student who had warned her about the dangers of the Queen of the Night aria, was even more direct in his change of heart. I've been studying voice for 12 years, he admitted to Maria after class. I've never attempted that aria because I was afraid I couldn't handle it. You showed more courage in 6 weeks than I've shown in my entire musical life, Professor. Steinberg found herself fielding calls from colleagues at other prestigious institutions who had heard about Maria's performance. The head of vocal studies at Juilliard was particularly interested, as was the director of the Young Artist program at the Santa Fe Opera. Word was spreading through the tight-knit classical music world about the scholarship student who had achieved the seemingly impossible, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Maria received a handwritten letter from an elderly woman named Eleanor Richmond, who had attended the master class as a supporter of the university's music program. Mrs. Richmond revealed that she had been a professional opera singer in the 1960s and had performed the Queen of the Night aria many times during her career. My dear, the letter read, I have heard this aria performed by some of the greatest sopranos of my generation, including myself. Your interpretation brought tears to my eyes not just for its technical brilliance, but for the pure authenticity of your artistry. You reminded me why I fell in love with opera in the first place, the letter continued, with an offer that would change Maria's life. Mrs. Richmond wanted to fund Maria's summer studies at a prestigious program in Italy, where she could work with some of Europe's finest vocal coaches. Every generation needs artists who sing not just with perfect technique, but with the voice of truth, she wrote. You are such an artist. Maria's family back home had no idea about the magnitude of what had happened until a reporter from their local newspaper called for an interview. The story of the factory worker's daughter who had conquered one of opera's greatest challenges resonated with their working-class community. Suddenly, Maria found herself representing something larger than her own success. She had become a symbol of what was possible when talent met determination. Her grandmother cried when Maria called to tell her about the performance and the opportunities that were emerging. I always knew you had something special, Mija, she said through her tears. But what makes me most proud is that you never forgot where you came from. You sang with the voice of our family, our struggles, our hopes. The video of Maria's performance continued to gain attention online. Opera blogs featured articles about her story, and classical music forums debated the technique she had used to achieve such remarkable results with relatively little formal training. Some traditionalists questioned whether her success was sustainable, but most recognized that they had witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. Maria began receiving messages from young singers around the world who had been inspired by her story. Students from modest backgrounds who had been told their dreams were unrealistic found hope in her example. Music teachers shared her video with students who needed to believe that excellence was possible regardless of their starting point. The university's music department experienced an unexpected surge in applications from students who had heard about Maria's success. High school students who might never have considered applying to such a prestigious program began to believe that talent and determination could overcome financial limitations and lack of connections. Professor Steinberg observed these changes with deep satisfaction. Her challenge to Maria had been designed to push a talented student beyond her comfort zone, but it had accomplished something much more significant. It had demonstrated to the entire music community that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected places when nurtured properly. 6 months after the masterclass, Maria was featured on the cover of a national classical music magazine. The article, titled "The Voice That Changed Everything," chronicled not just her remarkable performance, but the broader impact it had on discussions about access and opportunity. In classical music education, the scholarship program that had made Maria's education possible received a massive increase in donations after her story became widely known. Wealthy patrons who had never considered supporting students from modest backgrounds were suddenly interested in funding the next generation of diverse talent. Maria's success also sparked important conversations within classical music institutions about how they identified and nurtured talent. Many programs began to look beyond traditional markers of preparation, seeking students who possessed the raw materials for greatness even if they lacked conventional polish. As she prepared for her sophomore year at Westfield, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The shy girl who had trembled at her first assessment had evolved into a confident young artist with opportunities she had never imagined possible. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that her background wasn't something to overcome. It was the source of the authenticity that made her voice so compelling. The Queen of the Night aria, which had once seemed like an impossible mountain to climb, had become the foundation for a career that promised to inspire others for years to come. Maria had not just conquered one of opera's greatest challenges. She had proven that greatness could emerge from anywhere when passion met opportunity and determination refused to accept limitations. 2 years after that transformative masterclass, Maria Rodriguez stood on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City, preparing for her professional debut. The journey from that nervous first-year student to this moment had been filled with challenges, growth and opportunities that still sometimes felt like a dream. The summer program in Italy, funded by Mrs. Richmond, had been a turning point in Maria's technical development. Working with world-renowned coaches in the hill towns of Tuscany, she had learned to marry her natural gifts with sophisticated European techniques. The other students in the program, initially skeptical of the American scholarship recipient, had become some of her closest friends and strongest supporters. Her return to Westfield for her sophomore year had been triumphant, but also challenging in new ways. The attention from her Queen of the Night performance had created expectations that were both inspiring and daunting. Every subsequent performance was measured against that breakthrough moment, teaching Maria valuable lessons about handling pressure and maintaining artistic growth under scrutiny. Professor Steinberg had become not just a teacher but a mentor, helping Maria navigate the complex world of professional opera while staying grounded in her artistic values. The older woman had seen many talented students over the years, but Maria's combination of natural ability, work ethic, and genuine humility had made her a favorite among the faculty. The path to the Metropolitan Opera had not been without obstacles. During her junior year, Maria faced her first major setback when she developed vocal nodules from overuse. The diagnosis terrified her. Many singers never fully recovered from such injuries. For 3 months, she was forced into complete vocal rest, watching her classmates advance while she could only listen and learn. The silence had been devastating, but also enlightening. Unable to sing, Maria threw herself into studying the dramatic and musical aspects of opera with unprecedented intensity. She learned Italian, French, and Russian to better understand the literature. She studied acting techniques and worked with movement coaches. When her voice finally healed, it returned stronger and more expressive than ever. Dr. Norton had kept in touch throughout Maria's studies, becoming an unofficial mentor and advocate. When the Metropolitan Opera announced auditions for their Young Artist program, it was Dr. Norton who encouraged Maria to apply. Despite the program's reputation for accepting only the most elite candidates from the world's top conservatories, the audition process had been grueling. Over 300 singers applied for just 12 spots in the program. The first round required 5 arias in different languages, demonstrating both technical mastery and dramatic range. Maria chose pieces that showcased her growth as an artist, including a heartbreaking Puccini aria that moved the judges to tears. When she received the acceptance letter, Maria called her grandmother first. The elderly woman, now nearing 90, had lived to see her granddaughter achieve what they had only dreamed about during those afternoons listening to old records. "You carry our voices with you, mija," her grandmother whispered through happy tears. "When you sing, our whole family sings." The Young Artist program at the Met had been both humbling and exhilarating. Working alongside singers who had trained at the world's most prestigious institutions, Maria initially felt the familiar flutter of imposter syndrome. But her experiences at Westfield had taught her that her unique background was a strength, not a weakness to be hidden. Her fellow young artists came from around the globe: a baritone from South Korea who had studied at the Royal College of Music, a mezzo-soprano from Germany whose family had produced opera singers for 3 generations, a tenor from Brazil who had won every major international competition. Yet Maria's story resonated with all of them, reminding them that their art was ultimately about human connection, not pedigree. The coaches and directors at the Met had been impressed by Maria's coachability and her instinctive understanding of dramatic truth. Her performances in the Young Artist showcases had drawn attention from major opera houses around the world. Offers began arriving from Santa Fe, San Francisco, and even La Scala in Milan. But it was the call from the Met's artistic director that changed everything. The soprano scheduled to perform Pamina in their upcoming production of The Magic Flute had fallen ill. They needed someone who could step into the role with minimal rehearsal time. The irony was not lost on anyone. The girl who had conquered the Queen of the Night would now debut at the Met as the Queen's daughter. Standing in her dressing room before her debut performance, Maria looked at herself in the mirror, surrounded by the traditional good luck cards from colleagues and friends. Among them was a faded telegram from her grandmother, sent from the hospital where she was recovering from a fall. "Sing for all of us who dared to dream." The costume she wore was worth more than her family's annual income during her childhood. The stage she was about to walk onto was the same one where Leontine Price, Beverly Sills, and countless other legends had made history. But she wasn't intimidated anymore. She belonged here not because someone had given her permission, but because she had earned her place through talent, determination, and the courage to attempt the impossible. As the orchestra began the opening of The Magic Flute, Maria felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was the same feeling she had experienced in that practice room years ago when she first attempted the Queen of the Night aria. The same focus that had carried her through 6 weeks of intensive preparation now supported her through the most important performance of her life. Her entrance as Pamina was met with warm applause from the Met audience, but as the evening progressed, that polite appreciation transformed into genuine excitement. Her voice, now fully mature and professionally trained, retained all the authentic emotion that had made her famous while adding layers of sophistication and technical mastery. The standing ovation that greeted her final bow was spontaneous and heartfelt. Critics in attendance were already composing reviews that would establish Maria as one of the most promising young sopranos of her generation. But for Maria, the most meaningful moment came when she spotted Dr. Norton in the audience, tears streaming down her face as she applauded. After the performance, Maria's dressing room filled with well-wishers, including several Westfield faculty members who had made the trip to New York. Professor Steinberg arrived last, carrying a small wrapped package. Inside was a program from the master class where Maria had performed the Queen of the Night aria, signed by every student and faculty member who had witnessed that transformational moment. "I kept this as a reminder," Professor Steinberg said, "that our job as teachers is not to limit our students' dreams, but to challenge them to exceed even their own expectations. You taught us as much as we taught you." As Maria finally left the theater that night, walking through the stage door into the New York evening, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The little girl singing along to her grandmother's records could never have imagined standing on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera, receiving flowers from admirers who had never known her struggles or doubted her abilities. Her phone buzzed with messages from around the world. Former classmates, teachers, and even some of the students who had initially mocked her attempts at the Queen of the Night aria. But the message that meant the most came from a current Westfield student. "I saw your debut online. I'm a first year from a small town and everyone says my dreams are too big. Thank you for showing me that impossible is just another word for challenging." Maria smiled as she read the message, remembering the scared young woman who had once stood at the back of a university music hall, wondering if she belonged. She had not only found her place in the world of opera, she had created space for others like her to follow. The voice that had once been dismissed and mocked had become a beacon of hope for dreamers everywhere who refused to let circumstances define their possibilities. The Queen of the Night aria that had once seemed impossible had become the foundation for a career built on the revolutionary idea that excellence could emerge from anywhere, that talent combined with determination could overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from those who have fought the hardest to be heard.